on the record here. Right. Welcome to the Wicked Smart Chat, where I prove once again that all my friends are smarter than I am, which means I will never run out of guests for this show. We do it periodically. So tonight, asked my friend Brandon Withrow, whom I met years ago at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, to come on because I think Brandon has an interesting story that people on Blab might like to hear about, might find rather fascinating. It's an unusual story. We'll get into the details of it in a moment, but as you've seen in the title from this and the promotion you might have seen for it, the basis of the story is that Brandon was a seminary professor, which is a religious position. He was also a believer, a Protestant Christian believer, and he is no longer either of those. So he's left his job and he's left his faith, and we're going to talk about how that came about. Find that. I'm sure it's a fascinating story. I already know it is.
Yeah.
And get a little bit of Brandon's experiences as he wanders into and journeys into a new part of his life. So those will be the topics for tonight. There is a seat open right now, but we're saving that for my friend Jonathan Wilson, who is supposed to be co-hosting with me. I'm not hearing you. Oh, there you go. Moving again. Okay.
Yeah, it sort of froze there.
Yeah, just froze for a moment. All right, I'm going to close, just to be sure it's not me, I'm going to close down some more things on my computer here before we get started. For reals. Okay. Keep things simple.
Okay.
Yeah, your signal may be poor, but I can still hear you.
Okay. All right.
That's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you just fine. Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right. Still don't see Jonathan, so let's go ahead and get started.
Sure.
So, Brandon, why don't we start kind of near the end here, and we'll go back. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and especially what you were doing at Weinbrenner most recently before you left there.
Okay. At Weinbrenner, I'm going to adjust my screen here just a little bit. At Weinbrenner, my actual title was Assistant Professor of the History of Christianity and Religious Studies and Director of the Master of Arts Theological Studies program, which fills up most of a business card.
No room left for address or anything else.
It's the kind of position. That position is not what I'm doing now. Is actually an adjunct lecturer at the University of Philly, which is if you know anything about adjuncting, it's like freelancing. It doesn't pay, and you're trying to get scraps. But at Weinbrenner, if you would have asked me when I was doing my bachelor's, what kind of position I would have wanted, that would have kind of been it in terms of teaching. So I was there as a professor. I taught some heavy loads. They had me teaching everything from, my specialization is history of Christianity, but they had me teaching everything. I created philosophy courses and stuff like that. So world religions courses. So it was a pretty full position. It sort of filled that administrative need in me a little bit, to do something significant, but it was a position that I left, formally left in July of 2014. And I had actually given my notice back in January of 2014. So I haven't been there for, was it now, year and a half almost? Yeah.
All right. And we first met at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, which if people haven't heard of it, it's a conservative Presbyterian seminary. We say Presbyterian in the generic sense of the word. It's not a denominational seminary. It's not officially connected with any particular denomination, but it's Reformed and Presbyterian, as the name implies. It claims to adhere to the Westminster standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was developed in England back around the time of the Protestant Reformation. So Brandon was doing PhD work at the time. I was working on my Master of Arts in Religion and Biblical Studies, and our paths crossed. We became friends, as did our wives. my Karen and his Mindy, and had a lot of great times hanging out with them there. I'm going to bring Jonathan in now, and we'll let him connect. Hey, Jonathan.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good. I see you're wearing the badge of your religion tonight.
Yeah, I chose a side.
So Jonathan, meet Brand. I don't think you guys have met by video before, have you?
We haven't. No, we spoke on Facebook.
Right.
Yeah.
So Brandon, as I told you, Jonathan and I met here on Blab back several months ago, and ended up having a whole series of very fascinating conversations about our back. Just a little of Jonathan's background. Well, Jonathan, why don't you just briefly tell your religious background and your schooling and things like that?
Sure. I was born into a Pentecostal home. Let me notify my followers. I was born into a Pentecostal Christian home in the Bible Belt in a small town in the foothills of North Carolina. And born and raised there for 17 years, always wanted out, was a true skeptic around the age of 16, really started asking questions. My mother, who homeschooled me a portion of my life, ended up at the age of 7 entering into a homosexual relationship and leaving my father because of that reason. So at a very young age, the reason I say that is because at a very young age, I had to begin dealing with ideological division on a theological or religious level. And I remember flipping through and looking through Corinthians and Romans and trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong at a very young age. So I experienced that. Stayed in the Pentecostal church with my father, very involved there. Experienced some wild shit, really wild shit. And we can talk about it. It's very interesting and it's very fun to talk about and it's fun to remember. And I count it as evidence. After that, let's see, Pentecostalism. I tried to start a church when I was 16. After grad school, that didn't last. I was like, if I'm in, I'm all in.
Sure.
That's what I want to do.
And when you're Pentecostal, you can start churches when you're 16. It's almost kind of
it's even better. It's even fucking better.
There's a whole tradition of it. Yeah.
I'm a pastor's kid. I was preaching by my preteens, so yeah.
Right. Me too. I mean, yeah, I remember preaching on a competitive level.
It was a sport.
A thing called fine arts. Yeah, it was ridiculous now that I look back at it. But so let's see, Pentecostalism happened to me. I've been to Benny Hinn concerts. Like I've done all that. So coming out of high school, I was skeptical. I've always been skeptical, always been a thinker. Very, very skeptical. The only reason I went to the college that I went to was because they let me play soccer for them. And it was Southeastern University, which is a Pentecostal university in Florida, in Lakeland, Florida. And so I was there the whole time, but the whole time everyone knew me kind of like as this skeptical guy who like couldn't really decide. I was flaky. I was like, they didn't like it. And I graduated early there, had to make a decision on what to do. The two things that I graduated with, the degrees were marketing and business, but the whole time I took every religious class or philosophical class I could find and had been studying that on my own time. And my parents were paying for the degree, so they told me I had to get a business degree if I was going to get one. And I see why now. But I went on to graduate school immediately. I went to Trinity International in Deerfield.
Yeah, I went to TEDS.
Okay, yeah, I went there.
Yeah.
I was in 2 programs. I was duly enrolled in the Masters of Divinity with a research focus or a PhD focus. I begun taking some PhD classwork. And then the second one was an MA in religious epistemology, specifically a philosophical MA. So did that, left that after, did not complete those degrees, left instead and wanted to actually get my hands on something and verify. I got tired of the intellectualism. I moved to Africa.
Wow.
I was a missionary in Africa for a while. I attempted to go full-time there and raise funds. I experienced some wild shit in Africa. We can talk about that too. I still count it as evidence. And eventually couldn't raise my funding. told myself at a year I would move on wherever I was. When I did that, I was in Charlotte. I got a job waiting tables and bartending, and here I am.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Jonathan. Brandon, why don't we give you a chance now? We kind of went back to how we intersected and what you were doing most recently. Let's back up a little bit now and tell a little bit of your story. Like, how does one grow up to become a seminary professor? Is that what you wanted to be when you were 5 years old?
Well, I had said that I was preteen. I was actually an early teenager, but I grew up, and my dad's a pastor of a small church, 150 people or so. I grew up in that church. I always had a great
Southern Baptist Church.
It's right? An independent Reformed Baptist church. It didn't start off Reformed. That sort of happened in my teenage years. And I think it was always sort of thought maybe that I would pick up the family business, so to speak, and eventually take over the church. So I was urged to go on to do my schooling. I went and I did a bachelor's in theology with Greek at Moody Bible Institute, and then I went to TED's Trinity Evangelical Divinity School at Trinity International University and did my MA in Christian thought, and then of course at Westminster, where I met you, Mark, and where I focused on the history of Christianity. But growing up, I was always interested in a lot of different things, and it was either be in a band or do theology. Those are two things that were really getting to me. And the sort of intellectual stuff, is stuff that I really enjoy. So I just decided, I was going to take those 3 degrees and put them towards teaching. Although I was a little disappointed at how little professors actually get paid. But the problem is when you have your faith, educated in 3 evangelical schools, raised in a pastor's home, off at a seminary, my faith was really tied to what I did for a living. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that when your faith is tied to what you do for a living, and what you do for a living requires you to, somewhat sign your name on a I agree statement of some kind, then when you decide, this is actually no longer who I am, that's not really good for paying the bills, things like that. So all of that has been it wasn't I sometimes I see online, I see others that have gone through this, and I've seen pastors, the Clergy Project, for example, which has ministers who have, lost the faith while they're in ministry, and they have no way to support their families, so they're sort of in the closet about it. And I understand what that is like. I just kind of, I'm thankful that I have a very, a spouse who does really well. She's, a senior content strategist at Hanson. And so I was able to make a decision that probably would have been more difficult if, I had children and was the sole breadwinner. But so I made a decision to drop something that has been a part of my life for decades. And, it's not an easy thing to do, but I'm hoping that, I wrote articles in Chronicle of Higher Education, The Guardian, and my hope is that, at least somebody can look at my story and go, hey, I'm just like that. Yeah, I think I can do that too. Or, at least maybe help somebody make that step.
Cool. Before we jump backwards further and get more into your story of how you not only decided to leave your profession, but left the faith that you've grown up with. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the future for just a moment. What now that you've made that step, as you said, you at least have a little bit of buffer zone because your wife has a good job. But what do you want to be when you grow up now? Invent yourself.
Well, I'm looking at your life, Mark, and realizing how many careers you've had over the years. You're the reinventor. I've written 9 books, so I'm kind of building on my writing career a bit, and I'm working on a new book that sort of looks at my story from the science religion angle as to how those two sort of interplayed. and what curiosity says about those two. So I'm sort of like in the future, I'm looking at, a lot more writing. I'm still looking for other faculty positions out there and all that. But I mean, to be honest, most of religious studies, if it's just an academic approach, it's in a university that's public, and those positions are often filled if they're not being eliminated. And if it's not that, they're going to be often at a college or university or seminary that have a faith-based mission. And so finding that next position is going to be quite difficult when you look at, say, a job posting and it says must be able to adhere to X or Y. So the future is mostly about writing, trying to find a way to, take this next step and make that, at least part of my public identity so people know about it, and perhaps, something will come out of that. Started a new blog, which you know about, the Curious Ape, which is a way to sort of promote the sort of life that I think helped lead me out of the faith.
Yeah, and what's behind that name? I love that name, the Curious Ape. What tell us what?
Well, I mean,
name
being
of your blog.
Human and being, a member of the great apes. I have it as a sort of a curiosity for me is what I feel like has led me to where I'm at now. Asking questions and following the answers where the evidence leads. What I've discovered in the seminary life is that it's not really, some people, I see this online a lot. Somebody will say, well, Christians are afraid of asking questions and stuff like that. The fact is they're not really afraid of asking questions, but they're not willing to embrace all answers. And so there are some answers that are just off limits for people. For me, I'm a very curious person. No answers were really off limits as long as the evidence was there. And if there's no evidence, I was happy to live in a bit of uncertainty about certain things. You and I know, coming back from our background at Westminster, you had to be, you had professors who had these very detailed outlines of theology that said exactly what you're supposed to believe and why. And there was no room for certainty between those lines. For uncertainty between those lines. But for me, it's, if the evidence says one thing, go with it. But if there's nothing that's too clear, then, being able to live with that uncertainty, which propels more questions, which I think is a very scientific way to live, I guess.
I can actually pinpoint, and I thought about this the other day, because sometimes people ask you, do you know a moment when everything changed for you? And I don't think it's the moment that everything changed, but I remember a moment in seminary that was very seminal for me in the directions that we are now. And that was in a certain systematic theology class. And you'll probably be able to guess very quickly whose it was once I tell a little bit of the story. But
did it involve tinfoil?
The somewhat younger professor, so now you know which one we're talking about, was doing this elaborate proof of why he interpreted this one verse in Romans a certain way. And the proof went on for the entire class. It filled the chalkboard. It was like one of those crazy formulas that you see, in cartoons, the guy at the giant chalkboard with the equations all over. It was like that, and he's just guiding us through this. But somewhere in the middle of it, there was a moment when he reached a juncture where there wasn't anything that was really certain next. He could draw these what seemed like very detailed connections. This connects to this. The hip bone connects to the ankle bone, or the knee bone, and the knee bone connects to the thigh bone, and so on and so forth. So I just proved I don't know anything about anatomy whatsoever. But it was going fine, and then he reached this point where he said, and really at this juncture with this verse, we could go one of three ways, and they're all equally valid. But I think the second way is the most elegant solution. I like that. Boom, went on, and then he went on with the rest of the proof, and it was 75 more points to it.
As though it mattered.
Yeah, I got to the end and said, and boom. And so you can see why my interpretation is the only possible valid interpretation for this. And all the time I'm thinking, and everybody, half the class is nodding their heads right and taking notes, writing it down. And I'm thinking wait a minute, let alone forget, if we gave you everything else in the entire proof, you reached a crossroads in the middle. and you just said like, I choose B. And now we go on with that road. And, that was when I knew that, began to think
all is bullshit.
Yeah. Or at least
all
it's not really
bullshit.
certain, right?
All is bullshit.
So it began to open some things. You want to say something, Jonathan? About that?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I was agreeing.
Yeah. But you summed it up nicely, actually.
all is bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah. It was like all that elaborate proof on the board just came. It was like all the chalk just kind of suddenly fell off the board for me.
When I got into grad school, I said, "Why are they?" I imagine that the very first thing they would do before I started studying theology, like before some dude stood up in front of me and said, "Romans 9 uses the plural version of the word sins, therefore da 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 da."
Right. Yeah.
In the and supposedly in the original documents that we do not have. Just like, and he went on about that. I remember just like doing the same thing and being, saying, this is kind of odd that you're doing this to me without first proving the text. And for me, it all started with the doctrine of inerrancy. It was with the doctrine of inerrancy that everything began unraveling.
Yes.
And I had to sign a document when I went into TEDS. And like you were talking about, this document that has all the beliefs on it. I read through them, and at the time I didn't understand the nature of my critique fully that was forming in me, but that was I wouldn't sign off on the inerrancy point, and I wrote this big long essay about why I didn't buy it, and they let me in anyway. But I had to have this meeting with the dean, and I had to meet the president or something like that. And we were talking about it, and they let me in anyway. But it was just odd that they began teaching me theology of that detailed in nature without first proving to me that the text that we have is able to be looked at with that amount of scrutiny, this far away. And it matters.
Right, there are certain things that are just kind of assumed, and then maybe, like at Westminster, we had an apologetics department. So it seemed like the apologetics department, part of their job was to come in and try to fill in the grout between the bricks, even though the wall had already been built.
To show that things could be possible. That's what apologists are. That's their job, is if they can show that something's logically possible, then they've done the work of showing that it's rational to be believed in. And but what's weird about that is on the back end, they act as though they did more than just show that it's logically possible. They act as though they showed it was the case. And the rhetoric doesn't match, and you go, what the fuck?
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, when I started making some of my some questions, skeptical questions, started coming up for me. Actually, when I was doing my master's at Trinity, when I had a class with Wayne Grudem, of all people, who said, can you just think for a second about how weird your faith sounds to another person? And so what first is he rattled off how somebody else's faith sounded to an evangelical who's been born and raised in, certain things. And, it's like maybe if you hear, what Mormons believe or something for the first time, you're kind of like, well, that's crazy. But then he says, now think about how your stuff sounds to somebody else. And I remember thinking, yeah, we kind of sound crazy. But I just kind of left that back there to deal with and mull over for a while. And one of the things that happens when you're a theologian is, your skills are praised sometimes by how creatively you solve problems, and how easily, you can take and make a theology that is both orthodox and able to
not contradictory.
It's like, so you offer something that sounds orthodox, but does the sort of like offer a solution that, like Jonathan was saying, though, that isn't necessarily as proving that that's the right answer, but it's an answer that's given or something like that. And you're kind of going, but demonstrate that. And then at one point back in about 2011, when I had already gone full on liberal and was already ditching so many different things at the time, I started thinking about entropy and a bunch of stuff and thinking about what a theological perspective would look like. And I just remembered saying to myself, now I'm just making shit up. And the reality was I was making shit up all the time, but at that point, I'm like, this doesn't make, how would I ever demonstrate this to be real in any way in this universe? The theological universe, it matches the rules of that universe, but those rules haven't ever been demonstrated to actually match reality.
It's like when you realize you're reaching, you're like,
yes, when you realize you're reaching, right?
Yeah.
At some point, I had thought when I was younger, I'm all in. I'm going to embrace the supernatural in a certain way, and But by that point, I said that, and I stopped, and I typed a Word document, which I think I still have, which basically says, I'm either an atheist, an agnostic, or a deist. And that's the only thing I typed. I saved it so I could go back and eventually answer that question, which turned out to be basically atheist. So yeah, I think there are these, you don't necessarily always know all of the things that lead you to a particular place, but there are always these little things that sort of stand out as like, that's what got me thinking about this or about that. Yeah.
So, Brandon, I was going to ask you, I think you just probably covered it. My next question was going to be, were there some seminal moments for you or some particular things that stood out? I know it's difficult. I often say this when people ask me, like, how did you get here? How did you make a change? How could you be a believer for 30 plus years and then, suddenly find yourself to not be a believer? First of all, is in most of our stories, I think it's not sudden. Maybe let's ask that question, since you already gave some of your main thought points that occurred along the way. Like, what's the time span? How long does this happen when you think, the first kind of seeds of doubt began to be planted to when you woke up one morning and said, you know what, I'm not a believer?
Yeah, I think there are so many times that I progressively dispatched with ideas that I think were sort of like, like when you're moving, it's always easier to move when you've gotten rid of your junk. And so moving out of a faith is always a little bit easier when you've sort of jettisoned the things, I think it was such a progressive thing. So like, in 2011, I'm asking myself that question about what I am. And I gave myself this opportunity to live in a state of sort of agnosticism of sorts as a Christian, sort of in this sort of Christian agnosticism that allowed me to just say, look, you don't have to make a final decision where you're at right now. Some days I really felt like saying where I was at. Other days I didn't. I think a couple times, Mark, I actually messaged you on Facebook and said, I'm so frustrated, just because I needed somebody to vent on with, and I think I'm here. And then I'd go, okay, well, temper it, Brandon, think about it a little bit. So I think, you can't pinpoint a single thing. I think that, when I was a kid, I was raised in a conservative home. It was dispensationalist, complementarian / patriarchal, sort of in a not hardcore way. Over time, it was like, I know I was no longer, I was egalitarian at some point, and then I was no longer a dispensationalist, which for people who aren't aware of that, that's sort of the Left Behind series way of looking at the end of the world. And then, ending my teenage years into sort of Reformed theology and stuff like that. So progressively, I started learning more about how to interpret the Bible. But for me, the more I became an academic and the more I studied religion academically, the faster I started to move away from Christianity, moving away from the faith. And at some point, I was joining the American Academy of Religion, which is the main professional society for people in religious studies, and realizing I'm there because this is basically an academic exercise for me. Mm-hmm. Studying religion is an academic thing. It's no longer something that I feel, is part of who I am. So as a timeline, I actually thought about leaving in 2013, and I ended up giving my notice in 2014, and I had already started making that decision. But
I lost you for a moment here.
Mark, like we have friends other faculty who have lost their faculty positions because they embraced something innocuous like evolution or something like that. And I wrote a blog post that sort of was snarky about the idea of a talking snake in Genesis, which, you would think would not have to be too controversial because of the idea of a talking snake in Genesis. Talking animals generally don't occur in nature. But that led to some students protesting and talking to the board and talking to the president and the dean and the dean and the associate dean. They're really good people, and they would have stuck their neck out for me, but I knew where I was going, and I didn't want to take them down with me. So I decided to leave on a good note.
It's a very different and sometimes discouraging situation in a religious academic institution, not always, but in so many cases, as compared to a typical secular college or university. Not that secular colleges or universities are without their own controversies. They certainly have them. We see them in the news all the time. They generate them.
Right.
But there's a particular brand, and it's because the peculiar thing at a religious institution, religious higher education institution, is there is a pre-commitment to varying degrees to some level of dogma, right? And we were talking earlier about how professors and sometimes even students, as Jonathan was saying, have to sign a statement of faith or have to sign, acknowledge that they agree with certain things fundamentally, and those are not open for discussion. They're not open for questioning. Whereas in a secular setting, theoretically at least, everything is open for questioning.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you do. You question, you explore. Whether you're in science, whether you're in history, whether even in philosophy, whatever it is, you're totally exploring. But in a religious academic institution, there are just certain things that are set as off limits. And that makes it a very weird situation if you're an honest academic, doesn't it?
Yeah, like I said, I think it's not so much that there isn't room for questioning. So I had a class once that I was teaching that dealt with it was sort of a theological reflections type class early on, and it was sort of doctoral students, and I was teaching it, and for me it was, okay, I'm teaching this class, but for me it was an experiment, because I took every class as an experiment to sort of like test my students to see what they thought about things and to see how far they were willing to talk, not to get them to abandon their faith or anything like that, but just as human beings, what are they like? And I had some really good students who had some really good things to offer to the classroom. But in that particular class, I would ask some serious questions, and they would embrace those questions as questions worthy of asking, but the answers is where they drew the line. And I think that's why so many people get into, it's not so much about saying, well, is the Bible compatible with evolution? That's not a question that's off limits. But what is in some schools to say yes or no, or they have nothing in common. Like there's certain answers that you just can't traverse. Mm-hmm. So if you're in Bryan College, for example, the only answer is no, they are not compatible. Westminster, no. So I think that is true. That it appears sometimes like it's the questions, but I think it's just because once you ask the question, the answer is where the actual stopping point is for a lot of people. They're just not willing to take that. So one time I was visiting my father's church a few years ago, and a woman came up to me after, and she was new, and she said, I was watching this documentary the other day, and it seemed like they were questioning the Bible, so I thought maybe it was blasphemous, so I turned it off. I'm like, well, how do you know then that it was doing that? I mean, you didn't even bother to consider what was being said. Turned out, I think it was actually a pretty good documentary. And yes, it did question the Bible, but but it was one of those. But so to me, that was sort of the thing. Like her thing stopped at the question, and so we do see that. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of people on the academic side of the seminary world, it's not so much the question; it's the answer. If Jesus isn't the answer, then you can't. Then you've crossed a line. I mean, that's basically what always ends up having to stop.
That was a big thing for me because some people here know my story, and that was that my wife and I went to seminary joked that it was our midlife crisis, midlife crisis of faith, because we were increasingly developing questions, and we were in a church that honored the intellect, that honored questions to a certain extent. But the pastor, the elders, some of my fellow elders there, all said to us, you guys are reasonably intelligent. You should find a good seminary, and really just take a time out of your life and go to seminary. And if there's any place where you're going to get your questions answered, it'll be there. So I went to Westminster with high hopes. I was really looking like I was open. Like I'm struggling with some things here, but I'm going to be, around, I thought at the time, some of the smartest people in the world. Some of them were, some of them, well, we won't say anything not nice.
There's validity. They're good at validity. They're
Right.
good at validity. They can tell you if an argument is logically valid.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not good at determining whether their presuppositions are actually the case or not, or saying that that's an actual distinction that should be made.
Yeah. So right.
And then so they're smart insofar as they can deduce. They are good thinkers, and you can recognize that in them.
Oh, definitely. I would say that of all my professors there, they were, they were good thinkers. They were logicians. They were well read. They were well versed.
Their answers was like we talk about if you're like in science fiction and you think about, does this particular episode of X, Farscape, whatever, does it match the rules of the laws of that universe, the Farscape universe? Does it fit the universe? And that's the big thing when you watch a show, something that's fiction like that, and they do something that doesn't fit that universe, it stands out and it gets in your, gets you messed up. And I think that's sort of the thing with theologically, the logical cohesion is there for the rules of the universe they exist in. Yeah. It's that when that universe, it overlaps with yours, with the real universe, then things start,
That's a really great analogy. I never thought about that before. It's kind of like the canon of a comic book or of a science fiction universe.
You create your superhero god, and
But we had a few professors, Brandon, didn't we, who began to write some fan fiction that was that upset the people who controlled the canon.
Yeah, sort of like that. Yeah,
that's another story. So I don't know if Pete would appreciate his books being called fan fiction for the Bible, but maybe that's
probably not.
Yeah. All right. So, I've been talking about Jonathan. Do you have any questions for Brandon at this point before we get into some of the questions from our viewers?
I mean, I can do he said that he's an atheist, so I mean, part of me wants to dig into that. But if you want to wait for that, that's fine.
No, go ahead.
I would more usually use the term secular humanist because, coming from a faith background, I like to affirm statements of virtue and ethics and stuff, affirming things like human beings are equal and stuff like that. Atheism is a kind of a tag that I don't reject, but it's just not my primary identifier. But it was the easiest, it's the shortest way to an end point in this conversation to explain where I'm at, I guess. Yeah.
Right. So for me, the reason that I don't think I've gone as far as you've gone, or the difference between myself and Brandon is what, Mark? The difference would be that Brandon, are you still open to the possibility of one of the religions or some sort of synthesis of the religions being true?
I would, but my criteria for evidence would have to be, met in terms of
scientific.
Yeah, I'd say just.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that is a good way for me to at least have some bearing on whether something is true or not. And I didn't, to add to that, I guess, before I left Christianity, I did actually investigate other faiths to think about, because I'll be honest, there's some aspects of Buddhism, for example, that appeals to me. And so some of the conversations are very similar in terms of the things that I'm interested in. But in the end, what I came down to is that I prefer to follow something more scientific and And the secular humanist moniker is one that actually more accurately reflects the things I affirm and stuff about the world. So it's a little bit more, I would say, yeah, I'm open, but it would just have to be something that fits a certain level of verification. And that's not what I've found in religion. But I absolutely do understand, having been there, why other people can say things like, how can you look at the world and not see a God? Stuff like that. I understand the cognitive process behind that. I don't think that's the conclusion that should be drawn, but I understand the cognitive process.
Heard. I guess I would say, yeah. It's just a discussion that, Mark, this is just a discussion that we typically have when we're discussing with anyone, is the nature of this sort of claim right here between, and it's typically how you get to the heart of where people are like, oh yeah, they're talking about like the thing. And the thing, I think, is the possibility of our error. And I think we're all becoming very honest regarding the possibility of our error. And but what's odd about that is you have to think through that and then say, but that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It is possible that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. It is possible that Muhammad was a prophet. I can think of logically possible ways for these things to be the case. Are they at the moment? Are they verifiable? No. So any statements regarding whether they are or are not the case are meaningless logically. We have to, if we ever find a way to verify them, though, perhaps there's a way to verify them that we haven't yet found.
Well, that's why, Jonathan,
I'm open to that.
I always, just one quick thing is I always talk in terms of probabilities. I prefer to put it in terms of probabilities, not in terms of black and white, not in things of like, no way Jesus is the Son of God, or, boy, it's so possible.
The likelihood.
Yeah. So, yeah, in terms of a scale possibly. Right. But you were going to say something, Brandon. Sorry.
No, I mean, I'm just affirming what you're saying there. That is kind of how I see it. Yeah, I mean, so
this is what my graduate work was this rhetoric right here, was this religious epistemology. How do we talk about this part right here? And when I left Trinity in order to go directly to Union, which is the complete and polar opposite,
right,
and sit under the guy who was literally the antithesis of the guy that I was under, and study between both of them. But what I came out of both of them, I came out as sort of agnostic fundamentally. And then regarding the theistic and atheistic divide, it seems to me that all we can do, you're aware, from Westminster, you have to have read God and Other Minds by Plantinga.
I read several books by Plantinga, but after being slammed with warranted Christian belief 1,000 times and stuff like that. Yeah. So.
Okay. But so to me, what happened was when I understood that anything that is logically possible or shown to be shown to be logically possible is rational to be believed in. You then have to go, wait, Plantinga, why then are you a Christian?
Oh.
Why are you specifically a Christian? And he would point directly to the sensus divinitas.
Right.
Some weird form of verification that can only happen through relationship and that we just don't really buy. And so, but what I did because I think Reformed epistemology is right. All premises are backed by other premises that need more evidence and more argumentation, and all the way back and back and back and back and back. I think that is the case. So what that does to me, though, is it frees up the possibility for all religions, or a synthesis of all religions, or something we haven't even thought of yet or discovered yet. But I think the thing that typically makes me a unique voice in the conversation is I won't say that there's not a God, and I won't say that there is.
I would just say that I haven't seen the evidence for a God. Having come out of a worldview that thought that I had seen the evidence for a God, I do think religion is just based on some of the studies done in cognitive science of religion, I do think religion is a default position for human beings. I think it's a byproduct of human evolution, where human beings develop, say, a theory of mind and a theory of agency and these kinds of things that allows human beings to eventually turn that, it's a way for us to avoid predators in the bush, but at the same time can be turned into something that allows us to create bigger beings than who we are, divine beings and stuff like that within the laws of our particular universe, the way we look at it. So I do think that there is a lot, because it's a byproduct of evolution. I do think there's a lot about faith that does sort of match the way people feel about the world, depending upon which culture they're in, the particular faith that they're born into. That is sort of the thing that when they look at the world, that's what they see that makes sense in light of everything else. It's sort of a natural thing. So there's studies like the Princess Alice study, for example, where they took kids and they put them in a room and they said, don't cheat at this game. And just so you don't cheat, we have an invisible princess sitting in the corner of the room, and she's watching you the entire time. And for those kids that they told the invisible princess was there, they didn't cheat. But for those that didn't know the invisible princess was there, they didn't tell that to, they did cheat. So I think the idea behind that was simply to say, look, human beings have this built-in idea of who God is. And that's not to say having a built-in idea is not to say that that someday somebody won't come up with a scientific way to verify the existence of God. Having an evolutionary explanation doesn't eliminate that possibility. But for me, in terms of what Mark was saying, the probability of it being that there is actually a God and not just, a byproduct of human evolution, to me, that probability is pretty low. So to me, it does boil down to probability. I don't know how I would always rate everything that somebody might consider evidence on a scale, but like you talked about the sensus divinitatis, this idea that the Holy Spirit testifies to the soul, and that's how some people can just say, yeah, I know God exists.
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah, no.
So I think that when I talk to some Christians who say, well, I know this is true because God has given me this sort of spiritual sense in some way. Somebody else says, I know this other thing is true because God has given me a spiritual sense in some way.
Right.
And both of those things are completely contradictory. So at what point then how do you wrestle, in some verifiable way that one of those is true over the other? So two people can be perfectly confident about what, the truth of what they believe, but that they might be saying two things that are completely different, and they might both believe they're from God. So to me, it's about probability. It's about whether something is, sort of matching a sort of a scientific way of looking at the world with, I think, just the recognition that people can deceive themselves too. And that is what I think, we see with neurosciences. Human beings are capable of looking at things, and two people can look at something and see something very different. In terms of neurosciences, we are able to see how that kind of happens, where people are able to fool themselves. The sort of illusions of the brain kind of thing that you see on Facebook streaming by once in a while. Somebody's like, this image looks like it's moving, but it's not really moving.
Yeah, or the purple dress or blue dress or whatever.
Yeah, or the blue dress. Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah. To me, I mean, that's why I think sort of the scientific approach is a little bit better to life. It does not rely on one person. It requires peer review. It requires, being able to duplicate results and these kinds of things. That keeps at least the human being single person interpretation that could be completely false from being the only one offered. It allows an opportunity for something to be demonstrated as the illusion of one person. Your results, your study, how you interpret it are false because several other scientists piped in and said, no, we can't verify this. Like neutrinos traveling faster than the speed of light from a couple years ago, that thing.
Yeah. I want to clarify one thing that Jonathan said right before you started that last response. Jonathan, you said that your uniqueness was that you will neither say that there is a God or that there's not a God. I don't think that is your uniqueness. That I would say that. I believe Brandon would say that too. I think your uniqueness is that you believe that you're agnostic on the question of whether there's a God or not a God, but you still you claim to see enough evidence, as you call it, that you still practice religions. You kind of round robin practice religions just because they might be true. And our difference is, I've stated this to you before, but I think Brandon's probably in the same place I am, that we've come to a place where we see enough probability that it's highly unlikely, not that there's necessarily that there's a God or not, but just highly unlikely that any of the human formulations of God are accurate. So
you guys are more brave than me, or I'm a more conservative better. I think it's probably a little bit wiser to continue to practice specific things in case, because due to the fact
sort of a
that
Pascal's wager kind of a thing,
a pluralistic Pascal's wager, which is very different, and it's a whole different sort of calculation contingent upon which different theologies you're using. If one uses, a theology inside of Christianity where Jesus Christ is the only way to the Father, for example, this would be necessarily contradictory, or at least need to be maneuvered pretty in detailed fashion if it were utilized in a sort of pluralistic way. But yeah, I think that what will probably happen is that, I have this statement pulled up. Mark, I've shared this before with you. All statements are true in some sense, false in some sense, meaningless in some sense, true and false in some sense, true and meaningless in some sense, false and meaningless in some sense, and true and false and meaningless in some sense. And I think it does a great job of pointing out what we're talking, this sort of perspectivalism that you're
in some sense.
That you're adhering to, where we're all inside of the case, and we're viewing the case. See, where this gets interesting to me is because I'm very interested in digital physics. So the possibility that we are basically being that this is the fundamental nature of this world is digital,
or the hologram.
Hologram could be the case. Recently, they tried to do tests and they weren't good at they weren't successful at verifying it.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that it's not the case. It just means that we haven't found a way to verify it. That it is the case. But I think basically that because we can create worlds, digital worlds, with Mario in them, I think AI will probably happen at some point, and we will be able to wake Mario up in a sense within his world, within his two-dimensional world made out of three-dimensional code. And that
so
he will,
in a sense, world.
Well, hi, we're all sitting here like pissed, really pissed. We wasted a lot of time, But so I'm open to the idea of that being what's going on here, insofar as this is a programmed world, perhaps in four-dimensional code, and we're experiencing on a three-dimensional level, and that we haven't yet developed a way of verifying whether or not that is that's what's happening. But perhaps in time we will develop a way to, and we will verify which religion is true, or perhaps that a sort of synthesis of them are true. Because my reason here is because I'm like, I look around and the best argument I can give for theism is, hey guys, what the fuck is going on? Like, none of us started this thing, and typically people are like, yeah, it is weird that none of us know exactly what's happening here.
All right, I'm going to move us on because we've had this conversation a lot of times on here. Not that it's not a good one. It's a great one, actually. But just there's people asking questions. I want to get to some of those. And there's some people that I want to bring in as well. So, and, all of this is the wonderful thing about this is that we don't have to do it all in one night. We can do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Focus on these questions of specifics we're talking about right now. But just to now I can't get down to, it won't let me scroll down to the questions because Ramona just put in a really long one. I don't know if there's a way to drag and drop. No, there isn't. Okay. So I will try to remember them because I can't see them anymore. No, it's not your fault, Ramona. Sorry. It's just the way that there's quirks about the system.
Thanks a lot, Ramona.
You broke lab. I get a thing on as a host. I get a thing on the left that shows me the questions, and it's in the order they came. Most recent is first, but it doesn't scroll. So if you get a really long question, the other ones are down. Anyway, I remember someone, I think it was Ralph, might have asked, were there any particular books, Brandon, that were influential in this journey out of faith?
Well, I think that there were so many books. For me, any movement in terms of where I go is a sort of a nexus. It's everything hanging together kind of a thing. It's it could be any, at different points, different things about life that had moved me in one way or another. Grading students' papers will help you lose your faith. And on that one, especially because I had some students who were really a lot like people that taught me when I was a little kid in Sunday school. And I thought, wait, are these the kind of people that formed my view of the world? I did read all of the usual current atheism stuff. Just a lot out of curiosity, some of which I felt was, God Delusion was an interesting book, but really didn't, when you've read, if you go back and read Thomas Paine and others, it wasn't all really new ideas of any way in that sense. Just more like, getting some of Dawkins' emotions in there that sort of help you to say, hey, somebody else believes this too, or thinks this way, or. But I think one of the books that I would say was influential for me was actually a C.S. Lewis book. And that was The Discarded Image, which is what prompted me to do my former blog, The Discarded Image, which is still up, by the way. And basically just said, look, whenever human beings have always had this process of looking at the world. We start with what we think we know and the rules in which we think the world works. And then new information comes in, and there's this sort of collapse of things that say the way you're looking at the world is not correct. And so we seize on the next best way of interpreting the world. So, for example, one of the things he talks about is geocentrism, and then the shift to sort of heliocentrism. And that is actually okay for someone to, in a sense, then progress is about being able to discard the things that no longer make sense. These mental models of the universe that no longer answer the questions and make sense of the world that you are in. It's okay to discard those. And so for me, thinking about what things in my life, what things do I believe, or how do I think about the universe, and how is it that, why am I not satisfied with those explanations? Well, because they really don't make sense of the universe. One of those being, from our time at Westminster, Reformed theology and stuff. And then having the guts to actually start to discard those false, improper, poorly thought out ideas, things that didn't really match the universe as the actual data seemed to show. So I think that book was actually probably the most pivotal in the last 10 years to getting me to think about it's okay to move on. It's okay to stay true to how you see the universe. I think, it's madness to try to live in a way that you don't believe the universe actually operates, So if, the sort of like the old joke where you got the guy who thinks he's dead, and he insists on he's being dead, and then somebody says, you're not dead, and they say, I can prove it. Do dead men bleed? And the guy says, no, dead men don't bleed. So the guy cuts him, and he bleeds. And so the guy who thinks he's dead says, what do you know? Dead men do bleed. And to me, that's sort of the insanity of trying to accept something that doesn't really fit the actual world you're in. And true happiness comes with embracing that evidence that says this is the way things are, and not trying to pretend that you are living in a different type of universe. Because I think that just leads to sort of a cognitive dissonance that you can't resolve.
All right, great. That's very fascinating to me that a book from someone who is often touted as the greatest
apologist
of an atheist becoming a Christian
Yes. Yeah.
Was a book that was influential in kind of leading you out of the faith. Our mutual friend Art Boulay here. Art was at Westminster with Brandon and myself. Is here, and he asks more of a personal question, kind of, how did your pastor father deal with you leaving the fold? I think it's a personal question for Art. I hope Art doesn't mind me saying, because he also is a pastor's son who also has left the faith. So how did that go? Did you have that conversation? I
did. That was a difficult conversation, but not because I hadn't set it up. So when I was born in this area of Ohio, and when I moved back, I moved out just outside of Toledo to Perrysburg, and I was here. And my father kind of expected, I think, that I was going to go back to his church. And I had a conversation with him. At that time, I hadn't quite left Christianity, but I was actually in some more liberal Episcopalian, loosely, Christian way of looking at the world. And so we started having conversations about how I had changed in that sort of way of looking at things. Like, oh, okay, so you're Episcopalian, why are you this, So some of the things, it's easier, I think, for a pastor father who loves his son and all that to accept his kid's change when it's the reason, when he's still in the faith. A lot of the things that I had changed over time, rejecting creationism and all that kind of stuff. But, it's something he had some issues with, but at least I was still a Christian. So when I got back here, we had, as a professor, being part of the things about being a professor is that the part of the reason why people become a professor is not because of the pay, it's because of the schedule. Because you can work your time easily. So I'd have breakfast with my father at least once a week, and we would just talk about various things. So it happened over a long period of time that I was telling him about where I was and where I was. And then I kind of started just dropping hints after I'd actually left Christianity in these conversations a bit here and there. And I wasn't really sure how I wanted to approach it. Then one day he just said, we're out having breakfast, and just sort of puts his silverware down and says, so can I ask, where are you now? What is it you believe? And so I said, okay, well, I've been dreading this conversation. Well, let's have it. Because I know what it means. The seminary world I was in was more of an Arminian school, which meant that theologically they believed that if you were a Christian and you left the faith, that you lost your salvation. You had it, but you lost it. And in the Reformed Presbyterian world I grew up in, and that where my father is at, it means that you never had it. You didn't lose it, you just never had it. So these are just two different ways. I knew that no matter what happened, somebody was going to have some explanation as to what happened to me. And I went ahead and I told him. And, to his credit, he said, well, I raised you to be your own thinker. At least I tried to raise you to be your own thinker, to draw your own conclusions. And so while I'm sad that you're no longer a Christian or that you don't see yourself that way, I can't have it both ways. Either you're an independent thinker or you're a Christian. So, he couldn't raise me to be one thing and then be mad when I was the thing he was trying to raise me in that way. So he just got up, gave me a hug, said, I believe Jesus is the only way to heaven and for salvation, so I'll be praying for you. And I said, well, I'd be kind of disappointed if you didn't, because it would mean he doesn't really care. And that was how it went. So, I mean, seriously, it wasn't, there was no big blowout, and I think it's because I took my time. There are sort of two ways of, thinking about the world. Gabron's way of talking about, to a mother, your child is like an arrow, and once you let loose of your child, you can't dictate where that child is going. And then there's sort of this other quote that I have that talks about, where you go, you can't always take people with you. And I think that's always true. Like, I can't sit down. I know some people who left Christianity and they just berated their family for staying in the faith. The fact is that it didn't happen for me overnight. It was a process for me. And I realized that what happened for me to get. Some other people have a longer journey, or maybe we'll never make that journey. So I had to weigh out what was my priority. My priority was for my father to understand where I'm at, and he took it pretty well. So no fists were punches were thrown. No, I wasn't disowned. I wasn't cut out of the inheritance, though there really isn't any. And so I didn't have to worry about that. So, I think that answers it. Now I'm just kind of talking on.
All right, I'm going to bring in Douglas here, who is a frequent face on Blab. Douglas is here many nights of the week having very interesting conversations with...
I have an addiction.
Yes, I think you do. Almost any time I tune in late in the evening, I can pretty much put some money on that Douglas will be there and having very interesting and very patient conversations with unbelievers and believers alike.
But you know who I'm not patient with, and this is a great lead into my question, is precepts. So I talked to a lot.
I was on that one the other night. Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
You saw me in the chat. You were still more patient than I was.
So my question for Brandon is, I talked to a lot of Christians. I used to be a Christian for 35 years or so. Now I self-identify as an agnostic atheist. And for me, it was similar to you, Brandon. I kind of, myself, took myself out of my belief system. It wasn't someone's asking me question after question, but yet that's what I do on Blab. I take the epistemological route and the Socratic method route. But I'll have some people say to me, well, the reason why I believe in Jesus is because of the evidence. And so then I guess my question to you is, what would be the best first few questions for a guy like me to ask of them to maybe raise just a scotch of doubt that, let's say, the Bible is 100% God's word?
So when I was a professor, I'll just reiterate this. I never tried to destroy the faith of my children my students at the seminary. I've had a little bit of scotch.
They sometimes
some of
seem
them
like
were children, which is why I think about it. But I always wanted them to, if they're going to maintain a Christian faith, I wanted them to at least face, to take and put themselves under the microscope. So in a sort of way, like the way that they try to analyze other people, I want them to have a moment where they think about themselves in that way, where they slide themselves under the microscope. So getting them to think about other faiths, so in the world religion courses, for example, Islam, or just picking any particular religion that they aren't very happy with. Usually it was Islam. So I would have them, I'd say, what do you not like about it? What's your problem with it? And then I would get them to also talk about the things that they think they have in common. And I would try to get them to sort of imagine themselves as being, okay, well, yeah, you think that, I'm going to try to explain this well, because I actually have an entire thing of curriculum for this, which would not work well in a Blab. But trying to get themselves trying to imagine themselves as the person that they are rejecting by using the things that they have in common. So one God, for example. Why do you think your God is the only God? Can you imagine that person also, say a Muslim, thinking that their God is the only God? Well, yeah. Okay. So how do you demonstrate yours is the right one over theirs? Okay. Well, does this tell me something about, perhaps the reasons why, they accept Islam because they're born into it. Okay. Well, does that tell me something about, how do you know for a fact you don't accept Christianity for those reasons? So I try to get them to take something that they're willing to criticize, another faith or something, and try to frame the question so that they can put themselves in the same place, and just enough so that they might be able to see themselves in the person they're criticizing.
I tried that, But what ends up happening is that they'll say, well, I reject Islam for this reason, and I reject Hinduism for this reason, and then they'll say, but Christianity makes sense.
I just want to say good night to Jonathan. He has to drop out. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Good night, guys. Yeah.
Good night.
Later.
Yeah, it always comes down to, well, but Christianity just makes more sense to me, and they don't realize that to a Muslim, Islam makes more sense to them.
Right.
Or they'll say, we have that, I think you'll know who I'm talking about. I won't name him, but there's a country preacher who comes on these blabs quite often. I'm almost amazed he hasn't come in this one. Who is asked that question. Probably I've seen him, I'm not exaggerating, maybe 20 times ask that question on blab and, give the same answer. He comes back around and says like, well, Islam doesn't have a savior who died and shed his blood for our sins. And, you just see his mind is so absorbed in the presuppositions of his faith that that is his reality. And he's saying like, that is the problem, and Islam doesn't solve that problem. Therefore it's not the same. It's not as valid.
Yeah. And that's assuming that's a problem that has to be solved. Right. I don't think, honestly, people can come up. This is the kind of the thing. So early on, I said, I reached a point where I said, no, I'm just making shit up, and I realized that I was just building a theological system that worked for me, but it really had no way of being verified whatsoever. That is a place where I got myself at. I've never found a foolproof way to get somebody else to think of that. Now, I have had some people that I know that were, I don't want to say this because I don't want to out anybody, that were in, that were one of my students. And, and I want to say, I've had some similar situations, so let's not say it's down to one, who have actually had a moment where, after thinking through this sort of stuff, have actually questioned their faith, because they are able, I think, to sort of put themselves under the microscope. But it's so rare to see that. I think people have to have it's not just a crisis moment. I think sometimes it's just so I will be riding along, and one of my favorite places is up in northern Michigan, and you'll be riding along on the Old Michigan Peninsula, which is wine country and stuff, and you're not always thinking about it, even no matter how many times you drive it, you're not always thinking about it, but then you come up and there's suddenly a viewing area where you can pull off. But it's the moment you see it that you go, whoa, and you just have to stop because it's so beautiful, it's so clearly in front of you, and you have to take the time to absorb the beautiful lake, lake in front of you, all these, vineyard, these vines and everything in the vineyard, and it just forces you to think and stop. And I think for a lot of people, those kind of moments where you're just coming around the corner unexpectedly struck by something that's true about life, that forces you to stop and to say, whoa, I've just been looking at this road, but over here there's this better view. But those things are rare. I think most people, they just go along and they don't even bother to stop and take in the vista. They just keep driving. They don't even see it. And I think that happens a lot. And I think that but this is the case where this is why people are always beating their heads against the table when they're trying. I see on Twitter all the time, it's atheist friends and stuff who are just so frustrated that what seems so clear to them is being put on deaf ears with their Christian friends, and why can't they see it the way I see it? And I think it's just, life is easier when you come to expect that people don't change usually on a single argument. They have to have a meeting of things in life that bring them to that point where they have to stop and go, wait a second, this is, this way of looking at the world is so much better than, say, staring at the road and missing the view.
Yeah, for me, it probably took 4 or 5 years to basically go from a fundamental type Christian to an agnostic atheist. How long did it take you?
See, this is where this is part of the thing. This is where do I put the starting point?
Yeah.
On the sort of timeline. was it at one time when I went to see a debate with John Dominic Crossan and William Lane Craig and was more impressed with Crossan? I mean, at what point do I start to say this is where this path went off here or this path went off there? And I don't really know, but I would say that when I left Westminster, which is where Mark and I were at, when I left Westminster, I was pretty distraught about everything I had seen there, the way other faculty were treated. And the one thing that came to my mind was this. I saw people that were Christians, and I saw this group of Christians over here do some really good things, feed the poor, take care of the people in need around them, loving their families, treating other people well, honestly. And I saw this other group of Christians at Westminster taking every opportunity they could to crush their enemies. And they both claimed to be Christians. And I started weighing out in my life, how many Christians have I known that fit both of those categories? A lot. But it wasn't enough for me to say that Christianity changes a person. In other words, if Christianity was a pharmaceutical, would the results be good enough for me to take the drug? And the answer was no, essentially. There was too many, the legalese would be way too long about all the negative effects. If it was a Hulu ad, it would just keep going and going and going and going because it would never be able to end. And so, just in terms of like, if somebody says, how do we know, for example, this particular medicine works? Well, it comes down to the data. And while everything I'm talking about is really technically anecdotal, and the plural of anecdotal is not data, it's still a way of me looking at it and saying, these people tell me Jesus changes lives, but all I see are just people doing what people do, So that to me was also pretty pivotal. Leaving Westminster, I think that really got me asking some hard questions for several years. And I would say then somewhere around 2012, 2013, especially, but like I said, in 2011, I did ask myself, I think I'm either an atheist agnostic or a deist. I just hadn't resolved that for a few years after.
So I think that, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you think asking questions of believers is a waste of time? Or for me, there's a lot of stuff I didn't even know. As a Christian, I had no clue about, let's say, how the Bible was put together.
I think it just matters. It depends on, it just depends on, the person you're talking to. There are some people that are just trolls, and unless you're just really into banging your head against the wall, it's just not worth it. But there are other people that really want to have a sincere conversation who have never heard of certain things, even just the sort of cultural, historical background to the Bible and these kinds of things. I talk to students who think that, the Bible must be God's word because the book of Revelation is so weird and nobody's ever written the book of Revelation, a book like that before. And then you start to talk to them about apocalyptic literature and these kinds of things. And like, oh, wait a second. You mean, so if it was in Barnes & Noble, there'd be a section called apocalyptic literature that people could go pull yeah, exactly. So I think information is helpful. Giving people the information, it just depends. Is the person up for the conversation? Is the setting the right setting? And what's your relationship to the person? And there are some places where I think it's perfectly, if you're in ISIS territory, I would just go on living your life as quietly as you can for a while. There's some situations where it's not worth it, but it really just depends. And I think that because I see so many people treat it like it's a one size fits all, just all you need to do is throw this list of information at somebody, and then of course their faith is going to crumble around them. That really underestimates the power of the human mind to fix what they perceive as a problem, to find a solution that satisfies them. It may not be a satisfying answer, but people can find a solution for themselves, and that can leave you very, very much frustrated because they should be agreeing with you when they're not. And that's because over here, they're seeing a different answer that makes sense to them. So I do think that, you just have to say, who am I talking to? And be prepared to sometimes or often be disappointed. I mean, there's a reason why the most of the world is religious. It just is.
Yeah. Well, I'll let somebody else jump in the seat. I just want to say thank you very much for coming on, Brandon. I really enjoy this topic. And one thing that I think, I agree with you 100% on what you've said, but I still think there's some value in coming on blabs like this and doing some epistemology with believers, because they have these negative stereotypes of atheists, right? And so they're seeing a guy who's actually listening to them, being nice, and I'm not enraging them, I'm engaging them.
Right. But see, the person that came, presumably, now there could be trolls that come on blab too, but often that's what this is here. So if you're here, it's either A, to be a troll, or to actually have a conversation. That to me is one of those situations where you should be able to have that kind of a conversation. Yeah.
Brandon, before Doug goes, my suggestion, not telling you have to do this, but click on the little silhouette of a person next to his name, then you'll follow him here on Blab.
Sure.
And it's some night, if you just chuck on to Blab late in the evening, it's likely many evenings that you'll find Doug doing one of his blabs, and they're really worth watching. He's very, very good at asking those questions. He's very patient with people who are very frustrating sometimes. You are Doug. You really are, and people admire you for that. And he gets an audience. He gets people listening long term because he is patient. He doesn't blow up at them too quickly, unless they're presuppositionalists from Westminster.
Hey guys,
can't blame him for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks so much. All right, we'll keep a seat open here just for a few minutes, but I don't want to take too much more of your time. But here's Ralph. Okay, Ralph's coming in. Hey, Ralph. Hey, Ralph.
Hey, guys. So,
hey,
Brad,
Ralph.
Nice to meet you finally. Mark, nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
First of all, to be clear, you're both going to hell.
And obviously, you have, looking at your setting there, you have the books to prove it.
That's right. The Buddha says so.
Holy shit! What a library, man. That's beautiful.
Yeah, actually, check this thing out. That's like a Buddha painting that I commissioned a couple years ago.
I don't care about the Buddhas. I'm looking at the books. I'm worshiping your books.
Big old library.
Nice.
So I'm curious to hear you, Brandon, talk about Pascal's wager. That was brought up in the chat some time ago, and I don't think you got into a whole lot of detail about it. But that's one of those areas that I always find a little perplexing, because it seems it just seems an unusual argument to me that you don't believe, but you should practice according to the belief, because just in case. But of course, all of that, if you really kind of unwind that and unpack that, really what you're saying is you're going to treat the omnipotent, omniscient deity, that you're going to trick God essentially into thinking that you believe when you might not, because you're not sure. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, and if you've come up with people that have talked to you and given you this Pascal's wager rebuttal, saying to themselves, well, you know what, you've got a lot of good arguments, Brandon, but just in case, I'm gonna go ahead and do the religious thing.
I mean, I was raised a conservative, so the idea that I could fool God, wouldn't ever cross my mind. If he's omniscient, he's going to know, and there's nothing I could do about that. Was it William Carey, an evangelical missionary, who said, you can't force someone to be a Christian, you can only force them to be a hypocrite. And to me, that goes for any position, really. So I don't know. I mean, I suppose if you're trying to appease the one deity or something, that seems the least tolerant, and hoping that the more tolerant deities would give you a pass for at least trying, then, I mean, there's clearly other religions where, you'd want to be following some other form of belief than Christianity.
That's my more fundamental problem with Pascal's wager, is that Pascal, when he formulated it, he was living in a thoroughly Christian society, and so it was natural for him to see it as binary. You know, it was like either the Christian God or not, and if you choose wrong, choice A or B, so it's like an A/B testing situation. But in reality, it's not. You know, there are tens of thousands of gods, plus the possibility that there are infinite number of gods that we don't even know about. So, you know, the odds of you betting on the right God are actually very, very low, even if you took the bet, even if that was a sensible thing to do.
I mean, there are so many deities that have sort of just been out of vogue for a while. They might get ticked off if they're the real true God, you know, but we gave up on them because they're part of Egyptian mythology.
That's the plot of Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which is going to be a movie next year. Great. Yeah. Basically, the ancient gods get pissed off because nobody pays attention to them anymore, and they wreak havoc.
Yeah. Well, you know, in that case, I guess I have a long boat ride. But so part of it for me is, the Pascal wager thing, I think is just sort of a chicken's way out to me, in the sense of the fundamentalist faith I came from. It's just I'm too afraid to make a decision, so I'm just going to kind of go along with this God. And then I think, okay, well, doesn't that make your God a tyrant? So, I mean, for me, I had this almost ontological argument way of thinking about it. And I say almost because I'm really not sure it qualifies. But, you know, you imagine this sort of like this idea that, well, you know, imagine the most perfect God. And then, of course, if that God doesn't exist, then basically anything better is more powerful. I mean, I think about, you know, imagining the sort of the most perfect deity. And I think this most perfect deity must be perfectly loving as well as perfectly just. I would think that if I'm looking at, say, you know, I get some family that I think I've made the wrong decision, but if they were God, would never throw me in hell. If they're able, if they would never do that because they believe you should love your enemies, or you should love people that aren't exactly like you. They would love me because I'm their son. And so I think when I look at that, I see people that if they are morally better than their God, then, you know, why would I want to follow that God? But if that God is the most perfect and infinite representation of true love and forgiveness compared to them, then it doesn't really matter if I'm an atheist, because he's still going to love me. But if he turns out that he's a real, you know, asshole, then at that point, I think I don't want to be even, you know, doing the Pascal's wager thing. Why do I want to appease somebody like that? And so, and if he's really that bad, how do I know that even doing that would satisfy? I mean, he might say, hey, worship me and I'll give you eternal life, and then be like, no, just kidding, I'm a total jerk. Even though you did all that your entire life, I'm going to kill you anyway because, hey, it's fun. So in the end, I just kind of look at it as, you know, if Pascal's wager just doesn't really make sense of the God that it invokes, which is a terrible, terrible being that would force you not do anything to convince you that he exists, but then, you know, torture you if you didn't go along with it. So to me, that why would you worship that? And why would you even trust that dedicating your life to that being would still result in eternity?
Right.
But, you know, to me, I mean, but that's just sort of a long way of saying, you know, I don't buy the argument. So.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for having me, Brandon. Nice to meet you finally. Mark, great seeing you again.
Always good to see you, Rob.
I've got to sacrifice my firstborn. So later.
See you on Facebook.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Oh, this has been great seeing some good friends in here tonight. You know, people that I've grown to love. And you're one of them, Brandon. Thank you so much for this discussion this evening.
Yeah.
Really was a neat explanation. I heard more of your story than I'd heard before, so which is cool.
That's good.
And I hope that people listening in, you know, I'm sure we've had a variety of people, and more people who will hear this on the recording eventually. I hope that they've seen that to take a position of unbelief, whatever we want to call it, whether you call it agnosticism, atheism, whatever you want to call it, is a reasonable thing, and it does not mean you've become some terrible person,
right?
More like that. So,
yeah.
To establish that. Any final thoughts you want to leave with the audience before we go?
Well, I guess just there's been plenty of studies that say true finding happiness in life is about embracing the world as you feel it is and as you see it. Pretending that you are something that you aren't, to please certain people is not necessarily a good way to live. Just if you're able to, if you're an atheist or secular humanist, however you want to phrase who you are, and you are able to move on and be yourself, but you just have that slight hesitation, it is happier in many ways on the other side, just being yourself. And I think to me, that's just worth it. Again, a lot of uncertainties about things like what my future career is going to be, having left my job. But I'll take that over, being unhappy in the other ways any day. So,
well, appreciate your integrity in doing that walk, and much love to you. Love to Mindy.
Yeah.
Finally, where can people find you? What's the best place to find you online or get in touch with you?
Sure. So on Twitter, I'm at BWithrow, which you can see on the screen there. So BWITHROW. You'll find me at thecuriousape.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. But I spend most of my time on Twitter, I think. So, yeah, look for me there.
All right. Very cool. Thanks again, Brandon. Thanks so much for sharing this part of your life with us. And I'm sure we'll talk here again.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye.